Welcome, dear horror writer, to this video and to spooky month. So I've got quite a bit planned for this month, and I also have a special announcement that I am going to make next week, which I'm pretty nervous about. But for now, let's talk about demons, shall we? Because that's why you're here. To start off, I think that it makes sense to look at how Hollywood has shaped our ideas of demons, because for a lot of people, the images of demons from movies are the only ones that they actually really know, and those versions a lot of the times get accepted as the truth of what demons actually are. And the problem with that is that those portrayals aren't really that great. So Hollywood has given us a very particular image of demons, one that has shaped popular imagination for decades. When most people think of a demon, they see the familiar figure of a pointed tail, a devil with horns, a pointed tail, and a pitchfork. It's the costume party caricature descended from centuries of Christian iconography, but simplified until it became a cartoon. On screen, that image became shorthand, a way to tell the audience instantly what kind of evil was at work. But it was also hollow. We're told what the demon is before it does anything, and so there is little left for the imagination to wrestle with. The devil arrives fully dressed with no mystery beneath the mask. From there, Hollywood taught us the performance of possession. Children, who are often adolescent girls, crawling on ceilings, heads doing a 360, voices dropping into deep guttural distortions, and shouting profanities at priests while vomit spews from their mouth. And it's thanks to The Exorcist for setting this standard in 1973, which engraved the image of a young girl transformed into something obscene and monstrous. Countless films followed the same pattern that relied on sudden contortions, levitations, and a stinger on the soundtrack to create the jolt. Insidious gave us a red-faced demon leaping out from the shadows, while the Conjuring franchise built entire set pieces around bodies controlled by puppets. By now, we know exactly what to expect. The camera will linger, the silence will stretch, and then the body will snap into impossible shapes. What once shocked us has now become choreography. The religious frills also became equally systemized. Latin chanting fills the soundtrack. Priests wield holy water and crosses turn upside down. A few lines of Latin are uttered, a rosary snaps in two, a door slams at the first mention of Jesus Christ's name. These are the cues that tell the viewer that the holy is under attack, and these things carry meaning only insofar as the audience shares the cultural dread of such imagery, which many no longer do. Without deeper meaning, these gestures risk sliding into camp, a set of props rather than a confrontation with the sacred. Now, as for the demons themselves, they're usually almost always cast as pure evil who want to rearrange your house or slap you against walls. So here they kind of come off as having no motive beyond destruction. They don't bargain, they don't reason, and they don't desire anything other than ruin. The Omen showed us the Antichrist as a child destined to bring about the end, while the Amityville Horror showed a family home consumed by malevolent presences. And don't get me wrong, I love both of these movies, but these types of stories, the demon functions as like a, I guess you could say, natural disaster. It strikes, it devastates, and there's no way to understand it beyond the label of evil. That lack of motive, while it can give us some awe, but it also strips the antagonist of any kind of tension. And the problem with this is that an unstoppable force, more often than not, will leave the characters with nothing to struggle against except plain and simple inevitability. Now, by the late 20th century and into the early 2000s, audiences had seen the same demon tricks so many times that the shock started to wear off. Paranormal Activity tried to bring the fear back by keeping things mostly off-screen, by letting suggestions and our imaginations do the heavy lifting. But even then, the mystery eventually circled back to a demon named Toby and familiar ritual tropes. There's also Drag Me to Hell, which I actually did enjoy, that went the opposite way of Paranormal Activity and plunged itself headfirst into the grotesque and played its curse for both horror and dark comedy. Then came Hereditary, which took a different angle altogether, because instead of treating Paimon as just another monster, the film used him as a way to explore grief, family collapse, and betrayal. It showed that demons can stand in for the heaviest parts of the human experience. So what all these Hollywood demons share is their emphasis on image and the extravaganza that they create for the screen. The distorted faces, Latin chanting, upside down crosses, bodies twisting unnaturally in midair. These things, in my opinion, work like masks. They might be flashy and cool looking, but they're also familiar, and once you've seen them, the shock can wear off fast. Although Hereditary is one of the few modern exemptions for me because I think that its portrayal of Paimon is fantastic because it goes deeper to unsettle us, and that's exactly where we need to go. So now let's push Hollywood away and to the side and look at where demons came from in the first place. Well, like most cases, the answer isn't a simple one because every culture in every age has had its own idea of where these beasts came from. And what people called a demon in one century might have been known as a god in the other, or a metaphor for illness or a wandering spirit that lived at the edge of the village. Demonology has always been a mirror of human belief, fear, and imagination. So let's take a walk through some of the main theories that have tried to explain their existence. So the first and most familiar theory is the fallen angels theory. This is the story that most people know of, and it's the rebellion of Lucifer against God. The book of Revelation speaks of a war in heaven where a dragon and his angels were cast down to earth. Over centuries, Christian theologians and writers expanded that image into an entire cosmology. Demons here are angels who once basked in divine light but chose pride over obedience, so they were punished, bound in chains, or left to wander with their beauty turned into horror. In some versions, they tempt humanity as a way of waging war against God indirectly. In others, they're already defeated but seek to drag as many souls as possible into their despair. This theory gave us the idea of demons as tempers, whisperers in the dark, fallen beings who remembered heaven but are forever cut off from it. It's tragedy fused with terror, the monstrous born of lost glory. Then there's the Nephilim spirits theory that traces demons back to a very brief passage in Genesis. It tells of the sons of God who hooked up with human women and produced a race of giants called the Nephilim. And according to this view, when the flood came, it caused the Nephilim to perish physically, but their souls didn't move on. Later Jewish traditions, and particularly in the book of Enoch, expanded on this idea that gave us the idea that the bodies of these hybrids drowned, but their spirits were left behind because they were too corrupt for heaven but too restless for peace. So essentially what this telling is getting at is that demons aren't fallen angels themselves like we see in the fallen angels theory, but the disembodied children of that doomed generation. Stripped of their massive bodies, they're cursed to wander the earth in torment, seeking hosts to inhabit so that they can once again taste life through human flesh. Now, doesn't that sound a tad bit like demonic possession? Now, a stranger and less familiar theory is the pre-Adamic race theory. This one doesn't come from scripture directly, but more from attempts to explain the gaps in the Bible's timeline, which is why it's also called the gap theory. So here some interpreters have suggested that before Adam, there was an ancient civilization that was wiped out before humanity began. The theory imagines that remnants of this race lingered on as bodiless intelligence and became a tad bit jealous of the new humans who inherited the earth, so they became demons in their rage. Now, I know that those three theories are very religion heavy, but not all explanations for demons here are theological, because many scholars and anthropologists think that demons are actually just psychological and cultural constructs. Just think about societies that don't have modern medicine. Epilepsy, schizophrenia, or sudden fits of madness could easily come off as being demonic possession. The stranger who talked to himself, the child who suffered from seizures, the woman who lived at the edge of the forest and spoke to no one. These were liminal figures pushed outside the safety of community, and so they were labeled as touched by demons or even Big Red himself. In this sense, demons are like projections of human fear and ways to explain illness, misfortune, or moral transgression. They served a social function, drawing boundaries of what was normal and what was dangerous. They gave form to things communities could not understand, from disease to disaster. And beyond these four main theories, there are tons of variations that we can see across cultures. Like in ancient Mesopotamia, demons weren't just downright evil, but they could be like these hot and cold forces, like the Atuku or Ilu, that were spirits that either could harm you or protect you depending on how they were treated. So these were firm believers on treat others how you want to be treated. Or in Greece, the word daimon originally meant a spirit or guiding force, not so necessarily evil at all. It was only later that Christianity twisted the word into something more sinister. Even in folk traditions, we can see demons taking shape as nature spirits that are tied to rivers, forests, and storms. To some, they were guardians of boundaries, to others, destroyers who brought plague and famine. So when you take a step back, you can see that demons have always been shaped by human need. They can be used to explain cosmic rebellion, ancestral memory, even psychological fear. And when you really, really look at these theories, you can see that they're less about the demon at play and more about the cultures that thought them into existence. They show us what people feared most, like the loss of heaven, the loss of the body, the loss of community, or the loss of control over the mind. Hollywood gave us masks, but history gave us mirrors. So as I was saying in the last section, to understand demons, you have to look beyond the narrow window of Hollywood and even Christianity, because every culture has produced its own version of these beings that's been shaped by geography, religion, daily life, and climate. They're not always the same kind of creature, and they're not always outright evil. Some can punish, some can protect, and some may just be tempters that want to mess around. So let's take a quick tour through the world's demonologies so that you can see just how diverse and complex these figures really are. So in Mesopotamia, which is one of the oldest cradles of civilization, here demons were deeply tied to nature and survival. Pazuzu, who I'm sure we all know of thanks to The Exorcist, with his distorted face and wings, was a spirit of the wind, but also a bringer of plague. Yet, paradoxically, he could also protect against other demons if he was invoked the right way. So essentially, his presence was a warning and a shield all at once. Now, if we look at Lamashtu by contrast, was a purely destructive female demon who stalked mothers and infants and stole babies from the womb or from their crib to drink their blood. When you look at her, she really embodied the reality of infant mortality, which was pretty prevalent in the ancient world. And families were so scared of her that amulets with Pazuzu's likeness were actually often used to guard against Lamashtu, showing how people tried to pit one spirit against the other in the struggle for survival. Now, Judaism and Christianity also produce their own enduring figures. Here we got the figure of Lilith, who in Jewish lore is said to be a night demon and also said to be Adam's first wife who refused to submit and was cast out because of it. Over centuries, she became associated with stealing children in the night and seducing men, with her legend being shaped by patriarchal anxieties and fears of female independence. Then there's the demons of Christian tradition, which we already covered, that are closely tied to Satan's rebellion. Here, demons are cosmic traitors, fallen angels who chose corruption over light. In this worldview, demons are essentially eternal enemies that are locked in a spiritual war against humanity's salvation. Next, we have Zoroastrianism, which is one of the world's oldest monotheistic religions, and they framed their demons in moral terms. The Devas were agents of Angra Mainyu, the destructive spirit, and they represented chaos, lies, and corruption. But unlike in Christianity, their power was not absolute. In Zoroastrian thought, every human choice tipped the balance. Choosing truth and order strengthened the divine, while choosing lies and selfishness fed the demons. Here, demons were painted as external enemies and also reflections of human decision, which gave moral teeth to every action. Now in Islam, demons are a more complicated family. Here we have the jinn, whose natural form is usually invisible to humans, but they do have the ability to shapeshift into various forms, including animals like snakes, scorpions, or even humans, as well as other creatures such as donkeys, cattle, or birds. And these are beings with free will. They can be good, evil, or somewhere in between, just like humans. Some live among us unseen, others in remote places, and many stories describe them them as tricksters or deceivers. Now, alongside them are the shayatin, which are evil spirits that are aligned with Iblis, who refuse to bow to Adam. Now, Hinduism and Buddhism also have their own rich demonologies. In Hinduism, Asuras are powerful, often ambitious, and power-seeking semi-divine beings who are in constant battle with the Devas, aka gods, for dominion over the three worlds, which are heaven, earth, and the underworld. Now, they're not always evil in a simplistic sense, but they represent pride, desire, and opposition to divine order. And in Buddhism, Mara is probably the most infamous demonic figure because he's a tempter, and it was also Mara who tried to derail the Buddha's enlightenment by offering him visions of power, pleasure, and fear. So in Hinduism and Buddhism, we can see that the role that demons are playing is not really about wanting to possess somebody, but it's more about showing the war that we find within ourselves, like temptation, desire, and illusion. And lastly, we have Japanese folklore, which is filled with vivid and varied spirits. The Oni, which are horned ogres with clubs, are figures who torment and punish those who have been naughty and bad. And then there's the yokai, which are a large category of creatures that range from mischievous tricksters to outright malevolent forces. And unlike the uniform demons of Hollywood, Japan's spirits live on a large spectrum, which can give us narratives to play with when creating demons, because the yokai show us that the supernatural can be playful, eerie, and terrifying all at once, and who doesn't like that? So with all this being said, together these traditions show us that demons are a kaleidoscope of fears and beliefs. They can be plague bringers, blood-drinking child snatchers, tempters, warriors, or tricksters. Some want to enforce mortality while others want to mock it, and sometimes they like to mix the human and the divine. And what unites them is their function. They remind humanity of its fragility, its boundaries, and the dangers that wait when these boundaries are crossed. When we talk about demons in a more systemized way, few sources have shaped the imagination quite like the Lesser Key of Solomon, and particularly with its first section, the Ars Goetia, which is a full catalog, or an infernal directory, if you will, that claimed to record the identities, appearances, and powers of 72 demons that are said to be under King Solomon's command. Written in the 17th century, but drawing on much older traditions of ritual magic, the Ars Goetia became one of the most influential grimoires in Western demonology. It's part spellbook, part taxonomy, and part manual for those bold or foolish enough to summon these beings. And I would say that this is actually a great book to have just for the fact that you can get lots of inspiration for demon creation, because what makes the Ars Goetia so great is its structure. Each demon has a name, a description of how they appear, which is usually grotesque hybrids of animals and humans. They even have a rank in the infernal hierarchy and the powers they supposedly offer humans who summon them, from secret knowledge to infinite riches to control over others. For example, Baal, who is one of the most famous demons, is depicted with the head of a cat, a toad, and a human simultaneously, which is an image meant to unsettle while also signify his dominion. Ashtoreth appears as a fallen angel figure, while Paimon is a king who rides a camel and comes with a thunderous entourage, and Belial is a smooth-talking manipulator who likes to promise gifts and titles. Now, as I was saying earlier in this section, the Gothic demons form a kind of courtly structure, with kings, dukes, marquises, and presidents all ranked beneath Lucifer and his infernal princes. This organization that we see in the Ars Goetia reflected the medieval and early modern ideas of monarchy and feudalism, and also the desire to make sense of chaos by putting it in order, even if that order was diabolical. But the Ars Goetia isn't something that just magically appeared out of nowhere one day. Grimoires that are magical handbooks that are used to catalog spells, rituals, and spirits were a long-standing part of European history. From the Book of Abramelin to the Picturetics, people for quite some time were already jotting down ways that they thought they could harness the supernatural forces. And these books often blended folklore, biblical references, astrology, and ritual practice, and of course many of them were treated with suspicion, condemned as heretical, or just outright got banned by religious authorities. Yet they still circulated and were passed down in secret or were hidden within more respectable texts. And it's this urge that people had to write grimoires that came from the same urge that we get within the Goetia. And it's to understand the unseen and, if possible, to understand how to control it. When we talk about demons in the hands of humans, there's no better place to look than the medieval and Renaissance periods, because this is the age that was obsessed with defining the unseen, where theology, folklore, and fear intermingled to create some of the most enduring ideas that we have about witchcraft and demonology. And to really expand on this story, we need to look closer at how people came to believe that witches consorted with demons and made pacts with Satan, to how occultists approached summoning, and to how these practices were understood in the shifting intellectual and religious landscape of Europe. So in the early Middle Ages, church doctrine didn't always view witches as being real. For example, the Canon Esciopi dismissed the belief of night flights and Sabbaths as illusions that were the work of the devil, not literal events that were taking place. But as Christianity spread through Europe, older pagan folk practices like herbal healing, using charms, and seasonal rituals like those associated with the summer and winter solstices were increasingly being reinterpreted as being something that was demonic. And by the 12th and 13th centuries, scholastic theologians like Thomas Aquinas were weaving demons firmly into the Christian worldview. And it was Aquinas that argued in the Summa Theologica that demons did have the power to influence the physical world, seduce humans, and enter into pacts. And of course, this gave rise, and unfortunately, a sort of credibility that the witch was a person who can and does willingly ally with demons to work against God. Now, alongside this, the Renaissance period saw a revival of classic learning and esotericism. And this was also where magic was divided into natural magic, as using herbs, astrology, and symbols to harmonize with cosmic forces, and demonic or black magic, as in summoning spirits to control them. Occultists believed that through proper ritual, which was reinforced by protective circles, sigils, and invocations, that they could summon and bind demons for knowledge or power. Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy became a cornerstone for magic practices, which balanced science, theology, and the forbidden. Now, by the late medieval and early modern period, the boundaries between scholarly magic and village witchcraft collapsed into public imagination. The rise of inquisitorial courts combined with social upheaval like plague, famine, wars, and shifting religious reforms created some ripe ground for paranoia. And this is where the book that I love adding into almost every single video that I make, the Malleus Maleficarum, which was written by Heinrich Kramer, crystallized the belief that witches made formal pacts with Satan and sealed them with their own blood. Kramer also wrote that witches could summon storms, kill livestock, spread disease, and most damningly endanger Christian souls. And this is where the idea of demonic contracts took hold. Unlike occultists who believed that they could command demons through rituals, witches were thought to submit themselves to demons and essentially become servants to Satan in exchange for power. This sparked a frenzy of paranoia in trials across Europe that accused witches of feeding familiars, which are spirits that can take the form of cats, dogs, toads, or insects, and took the role of acting as their cute, fluffy, demonic assistants. They were also accused of holding nightly Sabbaths, orgiastic dances, and held unholy communions that were said to bind entire covens to Satan. Now, I'm going to have a video about witches coming out later in the month, so I'm going to leave that there before I get crazy with it, and instead let's fast forward to the modern era and look at how demons entered the spotlight during the satanic panic of the 1980s and 90s in North America. So this was a cultural wildfire of fear that spread far beyond pulpits and communities. Daycare workers were accused of running underground cults, musicians were put on trial in court, and even tabletop games like Dungeons & Dragons were branded as gateways to demonic influence. Courtroom testimonies, media specials, and sermons all painted this picture of hidden sects of devil worshippers who were summoning demons and performing dark rituals in suburban basements and forests. And the most frightening part about all of this wasn't the overabundance abundance of evidence because there was little to no evidence to be had, but it was the way that how the act of suspicion became enough to ruin lots of innocent lives. Now, running kind of parallel to this hysteria was the rise of modern Satanism, which looked nothing like what the headlines were claiming. Anton LaVey's Church of Satan, which was founded in 1966, introduced Satan not as a literal evil red-horned entity, but as a symbol of rebellion, self-determination, and human nature stripped of guilt. So here we can see that this movement was more about personal empowerment and spiritual exploration, rather than about summoning actual demons and worshipping Satan. But popular culture doesn't really like to make that distinction because horror films, talk shows, and novels decided to brush over the symbolism with the literal and fuse LaVeyan rhetoric with imagery of goat-headed demons and blood-soaked rituals. And what society ended up with was a cultural echo chamber of philosophy turned into fear-mongering, fear turned into entertainment, and entertainment feeding right back into paranoia. And the result of that was a period when infernal influence was everywhere in the media, in politics, and neighborhood gossip, and all because society imagined them into being. Now, there are also traditions where demons aren't treated and thought of as evil soul destroyers at all, but rather as figures that people choose to work with. In demonology, for example, as described in S. Connolly's The Complete Book of Demonology, demons here are actually seen as teachers, guides, and even patrons, rather than monsters that we need to fight. And within the broader left-hand path, some people actually approach demons with respect or even devotion. It's a very different perspective, isn't it? That instead of trying to resist or banish demons, the goal here is instead to form a relationship with them, whether for learning, personal growth, or spiritual exploration. So taken all together, these histories all reveal the same thing to us, that demons have rarely been passive in our imagination. They're not simply observed, they're interacted with. From medieval magicians to Renaissance scholars cataloging spirits, from villagers accusing neighbors of pacts with the devil to modern subcultures reclaiming demons as symbols, the big overall reoccurring theme here is human complicity. And the horror here lies in, of course, what demons are, but also in what people are willing to risk, trade, or justify in order to bring them closer and to make them real. Okay, so now that I have spewed all of that history onto you, now it's time to take all of that and put it into creating your own demon for your story. And I think the best to start with is what to avoid, because I mean, there's nothing wrong with using Hollywood go-to demon possession tropes. It's okay to nod to them, but using them alone can risk giving your readers a costume without a soul, if you will. Because if you want to create a demon that's going to stay with your reader, one that's going to bury itself into their imagination, then you need to do that deeper work and use ideas that are rooted in fear, history, and culture. So let's build a demon, shall we? So the first step that we need to look at here is fear, because the horror that you're trying to stir up in your reader is one that unsettles them deep in their core, not just on the surface level. So think of what it looks like in jump scares. So you want to think about anxieties that live inside all of us, like the sickness that steals the body, the desire that corrodes relationships, envy that eats from within, shame that isolates and taunts. Like, just think of Pazuzu. He scared people because, yes, he's a little on the grotesque side, but also because he embodied disease and plague. Lamashtu was feared because she was seen as this looming threat to babies and mothers. So with that being said, your demon is going to resonate more when it's tied to something that we already dread and fear. Then comes their role, because demons aren't lazy and idle, they got a job to do. They tempt, they punish, they destroy, and they corrupt. Lilith was cast as a seducer and child stealer. The devas of Zoroastrian belief were saboteurs of moral order. The jinn within Islamic tradition could sway between good and bad to test boundaries of human choice. So this just goes to show you that by giving your demon a role, it's going to create dynamics with its victim, aka your protagonist, and it's also going to determine what kind of unease it's going to bring into your story. Now, the place and nature matter here too, because demons aren't detached from the world and just live in the clouds. No, demons belong to spaces, like rivers, deserts, storms, mountains. Even the hearth of a home can birth its own spirits. For example, a demon born from the desert can carry with it loneliness and heat, so it could prey on those who are lonely and burn their soul. Or a demon tied to rivers could drown those who cross its path and lure them into forbidden places. Essentially, by you grounding a demon in an environment, you're rooting the demon in something tangible, and it's going to make its actions feel less all over the place and more inevitable because there's a system in place. And speaking of systems, you also need to give your demon some rules because that's what's going to give your demon its edge. Because without boundaries, then you risk your demon becoming overwhelming, erratic, and uninteresting. Just think about those old grimoires. It always gave the demons limits that said that they could be called, bound, or dismissed if the ritual was done right. But break the circle, mess up the incantation, or fail to respect the hierarchy, then disaster is sure to befall you. Even when we look at witchcraft trials, they obsessed over contracts, marks on the body, and symbols because those rules gave both structure and danger to the fear at hand. And there was always a risk of failure. So you see that when demons have conditions, it's going to give your story suspense because every encounter with a demon is going to feel like it's teetering on the edge of collapse. Now, another element that you can add to your demon is reflection, and this means that they are going to echo their victims by exposing their guilt, amplifying their flaws to use against them, or twisting their desires. For example, the Nephilim spirits were said to hunger for human bodies, which reflected the fear of corruption within. Or we can also look at Mara, who tested the Buddha with temptation rather than violence, which was a mirror for exposing inner weakness. Even modern forms of Satanism show demons as being symbolic and representing things like rebellion, individuality, or transgression. So whether it's literal or metaphorical, your demon can become a reflection of the human it comes into contact with. And finally, we have appearance, and this is where it becomes very easy to fall into cliche, because if we look at Hollywood, they tend to keep the demons trapped inside bodies and showing them off as just grotesque distortions of their human hosts, like with spines bending, bones cracking, voices distorting, faces taking on different shapes with yellow eyes. Now, not all possession films, but a lot of them rarely let the demon show itself outside of its vessel. But history gives us so much to work with that it would be a shame not to use it. Like, Pazuzu had the face of a lion, the wings of an eagle, the body of a man, and the tail of a scorpion. Bela was described with the head of a toad, a cat, and a man all at once. Oni in Japanese folklore were human-like but exaggerated into hulking, horned, blue or red-skinned figures with cruelly expressive faces. Even Lilith, who's usually imagined as this beautiful woman, is associated with having taloned feet or wings. So when you're building your demon, let it come out and play in its true form for a while. And some tips for designing their appearance would be to let its appearance tell the story of what it is. If it's tied to disease, then let its skin blister. If it's bound to rivers, then let its form ripple and distort like water seen through currents. Or if it's a corruptor, then let its face have too many eyes or a mouth that never closes. And another tip is that for building something to be disturbing, it doesn't always need to have loads of gore or over-exaggeration. Sometimes all you need is just a little bit of wrongness to do the trick. And with that concludes our dark journey through the world of demons. If you enjoyed this descent into the infernal, hit that like button to feed the demons working in the scriptorium's pit. Subscribe if you don't want to miss the next time the gates to hell open for future horrors, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next summoning ritual. Also, I would love to hear in the comments about what kind of demon makes your body start to shiver. And I'd also love to hear about the demons that you have created. So until next time, keep your salt circles unbroken, your mirrors covered, and your prayers close at hand. Bye-bye.